Welcome to the Bigger Cash Flow podcast, where we interview business owners and real estate investors that share tips and tricks on how to grow your cash flow and reach financial freedom.
What's up, everyone, to another episode of the Bigger Cash Flow podcast. Last week, we talked about short-term rentals and heard Joe speak about his experience working with Airbnb rentals. So this week, we have another exciting episode, and this is titled Getting Your First Deal. So in the first couple episodes, we talked about mindset. We talked about why real estate is the ideal investment. Our audience is probably wondering, cash flow is awesome. How do we get your first deal? Before we dive into the 8 steps to getting your first deal, Joe came across this awesome video, and it's a conversation between Larry King and Gary Vee, and they talk about entrepreneurship. Let's take a listen.
So did school fail you, or you failed school?
School failed me. School's failing entrepreneurs every single day.
Because?
Because it's not built for entrepreneurship. It's built for workers. You know, if you're being taught to play within the lines, and there's nothing being taught that maps to the entrepreneurial market. As a matter of fact, my biggest cynicism when I sit across an entrepreneur today is if they are too successful at school.
So what's your take on this, Joe?
Yeah, I love this interaction and conversation between Larry King and Gary Vee. Most of us, I would say, especially before we learned about investing, kind of have this very straightforward mindset of going to school, get a job, work for 40 to 50 years, and your 401k, and hopefully if Social Security is still alive, which it won't be for us, then you retire. But I think as real estate investors and entrepreneurs, the reason why school fails them and fails us is that you need to look outside of the box. You need to see all the other opportunities that are available to all of us, not to be just stuck in a W-2 job.
Yeah, I totally agree. I actually had a conversation with one of my good friends recently over lunch, and he was just telling me, hey, Bo, I know you're into this real estate investing. Isn't real estate investing risky? And I looked at him and I knew that he just went through a company massive layoff. It's a reduction in force, a RIF. And I just looked at him and said, isn't your W-2 job risky? And, at that point, I think it clicked. And he also realized that his W-2 job is not 100% secure, right? Yeah. It depends on the market conditions. There was massive layoffs in 2008, 2009. So making sure that you are in control, you are in the driver's seat, I think that's a huge benefit of being in real estate or any type of entrepreneurship business.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Let's jump right into step 1. Setting goals and educating yourself. So I think all our listeners are already educating themselves by listening to podcasts and reading books. The next step is getting started. And I think we all know that is kind of a barrier. There is sort of like a resistance. I think the tipping point for me was finding that right person, the mentor that can really get you over that hump. The other part of that is also being aware of your situation and who you are, where you are in your life, in terms of how much time you can devote, how much money you have, whether you want to be passive or more active. But once you figure all that out, and sometimes you don't figure it all out at once, I think as you start, you learn more about who you are, where you want to go, and that almost never stays the same. But the most important thing is to jump in and take action. I love one of our friends, Tyler Junkie. His blog is called Jump in Real Estate, and love that. I think that describes exactly the type of attitude a new investor should have when they approach real estate.
Okay. I have 2 quick questions for you before we move on to step number 2, is that you mentioned it's important to find the right people. And I have a lot of newbies coming to me and asking, hey, Bo, Should I pay for a mentor? Or how else can I educate myself? How can I get somebody to show me the ropes, if any? I have my own thoughts. I'm curious on your thoughts, Joe. How do you answer that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people out there who are very willing to help. And number one is you need to go and ask them and approach them. Number two, a lot of times, I don't know if this has happened to you where people have contacted you and they want to meet up, and then you tell them, hey, let's talk at this certain time, or hey, I'm busy right now, but shoot me an email, and then nothing happens, right? They don't ever get back to you, or you set up a meetup or a time and they never call you. So I think having that enthusiasm and follow through is more important than almost anything else.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head.
So let's move on to our step 2, choosing your market. I think that's very connected to the first part, largely because, one, being self-aware, do you want to invest locally? Do you want to invest far away? I think those are like the most 2 common questions that a lot of people have. And I think it depends on where you live. Obviously, if you live in, the city of San Francisco or New York City, in a very expensive market, it is very difficult to be a new investor in those kind of markets, largely because of risk, largely because of the cost and the lack of cash flow, honestly. So a lot of people, I think, then start looking outside your market. And again, I think the most important thing there is, who do you know? If you don't have that connection, you need to go out and find that connection. And one of the things that I've done in looking at new markets, so sometimes I have people that already have connections to a certain market, let's say Indianapolis, but Indianapolis is a big town, right? So your agent and your connections may be aware of a certain neighborhood, certain amount of certain areas. But if you're looking to go into a new market, it could be a new neighborhood in the same city. One of the techniques I do is I just go on Zillow and start just connecting with the agents that are listing agents in those neighborhoods that I'm interested in. So then I start to gather information, do my research that way. And it feels like cold calling, but these agents are super interested in talking to you, right? Because they're listing agents. So I find like a great amount of information from them, and I may find a new agent that may be able to help me who's an expert in that neighborhood that I'm interested in. So I think the technology has made it easy for us to kind of reach out and make connections and networks just right at your fingertips, right at the keyboard. The other thing is there are a slew of criteria that you want to set depending on what kind of investing you want to do. Buy and hold? Do you want to do wholesaling, Airbnb? So I think those kind of research has to be done in terms of making sure, is your rent to value ratio going to work for you for buy and hold? Are you able to BRRRR? So one of the things that I love to use is Trulia Crime Maps. A website that I love for looking at demographics is citydata.com. So Bo, do you have any tips that you use when you're looking at a new market?
Yeah, I do a top-down approach, meaning I look at the big economics, job diversity, population growth, things like that. And using that checklist, it's going to hit multiple different Midwest markets. Once you've decided on those factors by using some of the websites that you mentioned, like Neighborhood Scout, citydata.com, Zillow, Trulia, all of that have economic and geographical information. Then I have my own criteria of the acquisition price, right? Because it might be a really good market in terms of appreciation, job, economy is robust, but all of the homes are maybe $100K and over, and I want to stay at a $80,000 and rent to value of 1.2% or higher. So those are some of the ways that I filter out different markets and how I landed in Indianapolis, Kansas City, and Little Rock.
So in order to make that all happen, do you want to talk about the next step, especially when you do out-of-state investing?
Yeah. So step 3 is building your team. And David Green of Bigger Pockets, he wrote a book called Long Distance Real Estate Investing. And I really love reading that book. And he talks about the core four, which is the agent, contractor, property manager, and lender. So as you mature and evolve as a real estate investor, you'll want to work with various people. You might start, working with a turnkey provider who handles the acquisition, the rehab, and the management. But then you might want to get more of that equity, and then you're going to build your own team. Starting with the agent, one way that I've gotten referrals is through word of mouth with talking to other investors. I've also checked out Zillow, Redfin. I'll just hit up the listing agent. And typically, like Joe said, you might text them and call them and say, hey, can you call me back? And a lot of them might not call you back, or they might say they're going to call you back and they never follow up. You're able to gauge how hungry they are. And, this might be just my own personal method. I don't know, Joe, if you use this, but I've realized that working with kind of like a really hungry agent in one of my markets, he follows up with me within 24 hours. He's really active, and he has a little less experience than the other agents, but he still provides a tremendous value. And I can apply my knowledge in real estate and just collaborate with him. Another tip is set expectations early on. So you want to be upfront that you're an investor. You might be asking your agent to make 20 offers in 1 week. And some agents might not want to do that. They just might want to work with owner occupants and just work on, A-class neighborhoods, $200,000 and up, but you might be targeting $80,000 B-class neighborhoods. So you want to set those expectations up front. In terms of a contractor, you want to get multiple referrals and have them start on smaller rent ready bids or cosmetic rehabs, then move on to the bigger jobs. If you have any gut jobs or any $25,000 and up, I would say is probably not cosmetic, right? You can get referrals from investor friendly agents or property managers that might offer you to oversee the rehabs. In my book, The Uglier That It Is, the more rehab it requires, it might translate to more equity. Property manager, you're going to notice that communication is key. So without a good property manager, there is no cash flow. Some people I know have had success starting as their own property manager, and they get a couple rentals. They, see how the process works. They understand costs a little bit. And then they realize that it's quickly turning into another active job, which you don't want, right? You want to be passive. But I've seen investors go that route and kind of switch onto the professional management later on. But understand the key is that you need to have a good property manager who understands the market. So don't just simply go for the cheapest. There's some property managers who might do 5% or like $50 a door, right? And if you compare it to a PM who charges 10% on $1,000, rent, you're saving like $50 and you're like, this is awesome, $50 more in my pocket. But no, that person might not have the bandwidth to take care of your tenant and they might not renew. Then maybe you lose hundreds of dollars on the lease up fee. So instead of focusing on the tree, you got to focus on the whole forest and don't go cheap on your property manager.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I really experienced that personally myself because I had property managed homes for a long time and I was very unhappy with a lot of them. I fired and hired some property managers. So I thought, heck, with those guys, I could do it better myself. And after 2 evictions and 4 or 5 months of vacancy, I realized it's not that easy to be a good property manager. So yeah, I think good property managers are worth their weight in gold for sure. And you just cannot cash flow without their help for sure.
Yep, I totally agree. I guess talking about the lender, this is going to be the last team member in your core four. It's a good segue to step number 4, figuring out your financing. So there's so many ways to finance deals, whether you buy it all cash, whether you do a traditional conventional loan, 20 to 25% down with a Fannie or Freddie agency debt. You can get portfolio loans that are serviced in-house at local banks or credit unions. You can get private loans. So there's tons of ways you can finance your deals. One of the methods that I've used is I've used the HELOC on my primary residence. I've also used the 401k loan. So you just have to be aware of these different tools in your tool belt and be ready to use them, because not all of the deals might be a good fit for a conventional lender. You might have a property that needs a little bit of work, and a conventional lender is not going to want to touch it. So you might want to get a private loan or use your HELOC and then do a cash out refinance. So you got to figure this stuff out up front.
I think there's different ways to finance your deals. And I've heard this kind of hierarchy where people talk about cash is king. With cash, you have leverage on other buyers. So as a buyer, you will have an advantage. But the cash doesn't have to be yours. So it could be someone else's cash, like you mentioned. And certainly hard money and also private lending is a fantastic way to use somebody else's cash to do your deals. Credit is queen. Leverage is a huge part of why real estate has such an advantage compared to things like stocks. And lastly, the huge importance of reserves. I think, in real estate, we all face challenges. And if you don't have those reserves in cash or stocks or your regular income, your ability to save, if you don't have that kind of resilience against these sudden expenses, sudden vacancies that you didn't expect, or prolonged vacancies, you face the challenge of maybe possibly losing your investment. And I think that's kind of the worst thing that can happen.
I know everybody has a different amount. Do you have a rule of thumb? I personally try to keep at least $4,000 per rental property. Some people might be like, hey, I have rental property insurance, so if I have a major CapEx item, I'm covered. But what about the insurance deductible? You got to make sure that you have enough money on hand to pay for the deductible and some other pesky items that might just not hit that threshold, right? So if your deductible is $2,500 and it's $2,000 and you have a couple of those across your portfolio, you better be ready to shell out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the ways you can do this is, for me, I can use the HELOC as sort of like a buffer as well. So I call that debt capital.
I love it.
Yeah, because that money is not just sitting there doing nothing. It's, you can access it when you need to, but you're not paying any interest on it if you don't need it. So I love that method as well.
So let's talk about leads.
So getting those leads on real estate, there's so many different ways. I mean, I've tried the more direct method of driving for dollars. I think that takes a bit of time and commitment and a little bit of ability to know your neighborhood. And I think the best leads are going to be coming from key players like your real estate agents, wholesalers, and your investor friends.
Oh, yeah. To that note, I just came back from the 10X conference in Miami, and day 2, we had a networking session. And I was talking to one of these wholesalers, and I told him, hey, I'm active in Kansas City and Little Rock. And he's like, hey, I have 3 buddies. And he made the email intro, and a couple of days later, I have 2 deals in my inbox that I'm underwriting. You might not be expecting some leads from different people, but you never know when leads can present itself. So you want to be always networking and always talking to a lot of people when you're in this game. So let's just say we got 2 leads in our inbox, whether it be from wholesalers or turnkey providers. The next step is starting to analyze these deals. So there's a lot of investors who are overwhelmed with the fact that they're unsure if they're buying a good deal or a potential money pit. So remember, practice is key when it comes to underwriting deals and also setting a foundation of knowledge for future leads. So the more you have seen and calculated the cash on cash or cap rate of deals coming your way, the easier it will be for you to realize one, maybe a winner before another investor takes it. So the good deals that are on the market only last for so long. So speed will be a crucial factor in building your portfolio. The speed it takes you to find deals, make offers, and close on them will differentiate you from the competition. So in this hot market, I see a lot of investors get so excited, they forget to set a baseline criteria for their acquisition and target return on investment, meaning they might get emotionally attached to a certain property. They forget that the property needs to cash flow. It's important that you set this early on by talking to different investors and agents who are familiar with the cap rates of a neighborhood and ensure your deal meets the mark. When I first started, I probably looked at 20 to 30 deals before I made an offer. Now I probably look at double the amount, 50 to 60, before I even think one is worth offering on. And even then, the seller might not even like my price. So let's just say, I looked at 50 deals and I made an offer on one of them. Now you got to talk with the seller and see if they're willing to take that offer, right? So it's time to negotiate. When I make offers, this is step number 7. There's a couple ways that I do this. And Joe, you can chime in on your strategy, but I don't like to make just one offer because it gives them the option to say yes or no. So what I do is I probably present them with 2 or 3 options. One's going to be all cash, and it's not a low ball per se, but it's lower. It's going to be drastically lower than the market value. And the second one is a little bit closer to what they're asking for. It's going to be through a conventional financing. And the third, I always kind of open up the door for, any subject twos or seller financing. And the reason why I do this is then it gives the seller the thought that they have multiple options, this cash offer or this financing or this sub two or seller financing. And they might come back to me with an adjusted offer on one of these terms instead of a straight out yes or no. Because one of the mistakes that I made early on is taking too long to underwrite these deals, and I missed out on, multiple opportunities. You might be asking yourself, hey, Bo, what if I make an all cash offer and I only have enough money for a 20% down payment? So what I do is I make the cash offer so appealing that if the seller decides to take that offer, I can probably reach out to my network and get a private lender very fast, because I'm talking like 40, 50 cents on the dollar, right? So don't be afraid wondering, hey, I don't have the money. What do I do? Just make sure you have a good deal and the money will follow. Once you've gotten the offer accepted, it's time to do your due diligence. You definitely have to get an inspector to inspect your home and look for anything that may have not been previously disclosed by the seller. If there's any capex items like the roof, the foundation, electrical, plumbing, all of these are major dollar items that you want to understand upfront and go back to the seller and negotiate a better price. Remember that it isn't you versus the seller. It's the current market conditions, the after repair value, the rental rates, the property taxes, along with the rehab needed, that's causing you to negotiate the numbers that make sense. So it's you and the seller versus the market. That's very important when you're negotiating.
Yeah, no, I love that, because on the seller side, because I've sold several of my buy and holds, and I've sold 5 properties. I do remember when there's an inspection report and the buyer says, hey, there's this problem, can you fix it? I definitely felt the pressure to want to, meet them halfway at least, because you don't want to go, you just found this buyer after, a certain process, and you don't want to waste time to go find another buyer, then gets another home inspection that has the exact same problems that you'll have to deal with anyway. So I think a lot of times we should not be afraid to negotiate, at the very minimum, meet halfway with the seller for certain items. And then on other items, you should ask for a full refund or full coverage. So even my very first deal with buy and hold, with a turnkey provider, I remember the roof was really in bad shape. The home inspection, it said it probably only had less than 5 years left. And so I was really concerned. And I talked to the turnkey provider and I said, hey, what do you think about this? I think this, he's like, oh, the roof is going to last for 10 plus years. And I said, but the inspection report says otherwise. And so we negotiated. He gave me a $2,000 credit for the roof. Sure enough, 1 year passed by. I spent $5,500 on a brand new roof, right? So, I mean, I didn't get all of it, but I got some of it back. So I think negotiating is really key, and don't be afraid to address all those things on the inspection report. So let's move on to the last step, which is closing and beyond, owning your portfolio. So I think this is the part that some of us really don't enjoy sometimes, which is managing the portfolio. That's true for me. I love the hunt. I love looking for properties, finding properties, and then like the kind of a long road of managing. I think that is such an important part of being successful in real estate. And I'm like slowly learning how to do that better. So one of the things I always like to say is when we think of buy and hold, we think it's supposed to be passive, but I would put quotation marks around passive because it's very important to actively manage your managers. The other thing I think that's really important in real estate is don't get too greedy. Because I think one of the number one ways to make money in buy and hold is to have a great tenant and for them to never leave your house, right? So I know people who have strategies of either having the rent slightly lower than market rent or just never raising rents on a fantastic tenant, because the amount of money that turnover is going to eat into your cash flow, eat into your reserves even, can be tremendous. So if somebody is staying at the house and they have issues at the house, they already live at the house. They don't know that, it's a problem. But when somebody leaves the house, you have to maybe possibly repaint the house. You have to repair all the damages. You have to make it presentable for the next tenant. And there's a large cost for that. So I really love the idea of do whatever you can to keep the good tenants in place as much as possible, because that's how you're going to make money in real estate, is to have long-term good tenants. And the other thing I think that's very important about owning your portfolio and maintaining your portfolio is to be resilient and patient. A lot of times I would say in buy and hold, you may not make money the first year. You may make money the second year. You may not make that much money on your first property. So I think having that patience about real estate, it's not overnight. It doesn't happen instantly. You need to roll with the punches. Don't be scared when you have your first CapEx hit you, because that hits all of us. But if the investor who has 100 units, 100 doors had stopped because their second property had a problem with the roof, they would never get to 100. They would stop at 2. So I think that's something that's really important, to have that kind of long-term vision and resilience. And, if you're facing some trials, I think the best thing to do is talk to your fellow investors, and they'll tell you even worse horror stories about what they're going through, what they've gone through. So I think that's a very important thing to do, is have a group of friends and investors that you can go to kind of share your ideas, but also share your difficulties and challenges, because I think they can give you tips. But the most important thing they can give you is some moral support and share their issues, so that you understand that you're not the only person facing those kind of trials.
Yeah, no, this is great stuff. So I think that wraps up, step 1 through 8 in terms of getting your first deal. Step 1, we talked about setting your goals and educating yourself. Step 2, choosing the right market. Step 3, building your team. Step 4, figuring out your financing. Step 5, getting leads. Step 6, analyzing deals. Step 7, making an offer and negotiating your deal. And step 8, closing and beyond, owning your portfolio. This wraps up this week's episode. And if you thought that was helpful, please do us a favor and give us a 5-star review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you may be listening. Next week, we have episode 8. We're going to have Sean Huss, the Senior Vice President of Chemical Bank, with us, and he's going to talk about Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, conventional lending, and how investors like you can prepare, get pre-approval, and lock down that first deal, so you don't want to miss it. Thank you for listening, and see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Bigger Cash Flow podcast. Please remember that opinions of the guests are their own, and nothing on this show should be considered personal or professional advice. Please consult your tax, legal, or financial advisor for personal advice that fit your unique situation. See you next time.